The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in November of 1937, delivered by a man who knocked twice and left before Mame Johnson could get to the door. It was from Alcatraz, Bumpy's handwriting on the outside, careful and deliberate the way it always was when he wrote from inside, as if the act of writing itself required demonstration that he was still intact. She had been receiving letters from prisons for 3 years by then, from Sing Sing before Alcatraz, and she had learned to read them the way she learned to read most things, not for what they said, but for what they were careful not to say, the shape of the absence as much as the presence of the words. This letter was different from the others. It was shorter, and in its brevity, in the specific things it chose to say and not say. She understood something that the letter itself never stated directly. Bumpy was not coming home soon, and the operation in Harlem could not wait for Bumpy to come home. She sat with that understanding for 20 minutes in the kitchen of their apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, the letter folded on the table in front of her, the November light pressing through the window, the sound of the neighborhood below doing its ordinary business. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and went downstairs to begin doing what needed to be done. This was how Mame Hatcher Johnson worked. Not with announcement, not with drama, not with the kind of visible decision-making that required an audience to confirm it had happened. She simply looked at what was in front of her and did what it required. And the people who knew her well enough to notice what was actually happening understood that this quality, the ability to assess a situation accurately and respond to it without the intermediary of performance, was more rare and more valuable than almost anything else a person could possess. She had been born Mame Hatcher in 1912, in a Harlem that was still forming itself into what it would become, still absorbing the enormous migration of Black Americans from the South, who arrived with nothing but capacity and proceeded to build one of the most significant cultural and intellectual communities in American history. Her parents were among the early arrivals. Her father, a carpenter from Georgia who had come north with a specific intention of finding a place where the ceiling on a black man's ambitions was set by his abilities rather than by the state's interest in limiting them. She had grown up watching her father navigate a world that was more open than the one he had left, but still considerably less open than the one he deserved, and the watching had given her an education that no school she attended could have provided. She learned to read the difference between what people said and what they meant. She learned to identify whose interests an arrangement served and whose it didn't. She learned that the people who moved most effectively through the world were not always the most visible or the most loud, but the ones who understood the difference between what was possible and what was actually achievable, and who directed their energy accordingly. She met Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson in 1929 at a community dance on 133rd Street, at the beginning of what would become one of the most significant partnerships in Harlem's 20th century history. The account she gave of that meeting in interviews and in her eventual memoir was characteristically precise without being sentimental. She had noticed him not because of his reputation, which she was aware of, but because of the specific way he moved through a room, which was the way of a man who was always gathering information. She recognized this quality in him because it was also true of her, and the recognition of a quality you possess in another person is one of the most reliable forms of initial connection available. They courted in the way that people courted in Harlem in 1929 and 1930, which was with the particular mixture of formality and directness that characterized the community's social life. He was already someone in Harlem by then. Already the kind of man whose name people knew and whose activities people discussed in the specific tones reserved for figures whose significance was understood even if their nature was complicated. She was not naive about what his life was. She had grown up in Harlem. She knew what kinds of lives were available to black men in New York in 1930, and she understood, clearly and without sentimentality, that the options were constrained in ways that the city's official narrative about opportunity and hard work preferred not to acknowledge. What she chose, in choosing Bumpy Johnson, was not a life she hadn't thought about. It was a life she had thought about carefully and decided was the one she wanted, for reasons that were her own and that she never felt the obligation to explain to people who hadn't done the same thinking. They married in 1948, but their life together began long before the marriage. The partnership, which is the word that most accurately describes what they built between them, was in practice from the early 1930s, conducted across prison visiting rooms and through correspondence and in the apartment on Edgecombe Avenue where Mame managed the visible world while Bumpy managed from wherever he happened to be at any given time. The first extended test of her capacity came in 1932, when Bumpy went to prison for the first time on charges that were accurate in their description of the activities he had engaged in and incomplete in their account of the context in which those activities had taken place. Mame was 20 years old. She had a network of relationships in Harlem, a clear understanding of what Bumpy's organization required to continue functioning in his absence, and a quality of judgment that the people who worked with her had already come to rely on even when Bumpy was present. She did not take over the organization in any formal or visible sense. That would have been both impossible and unwise. Impossible because the world of 1932, Harlem, was not one in which a woman in her position could assume visible leadership of a criminal enterprise without attracting exactly the kinds of attention that would destroy it. And unwise because visibility was rarely the correct strategy in circumstances that required stability. What she did instead was what she had always done, which was to make herself the indispensable center of information and communication, the person through whom all significant decisions passed even when the credit for those decisions attached to someone else. This required an understanding of how to exercise power that most people who wrote about power had never needed to develop, because most people who wrote about power had access to its visible forms. Mame had access only to its invisible ones, which were in many respects more durable and more effective, because they did not require the maintenance costs that visible power demanded. She did not need to project authority. She needed only to possess it, and possession was something she had managed since long before anyone thought to give her credit for it. The specific mechanisms through which she exercised that invisible authority were various. She maintained the correspondence with the lawyers, not simply receiving their updates and passing them along, but engaging with the legal strategy in sufficient detail that she could evaluate it rather than simply accept it, and redirect it when she believed it needed redirecting. She managed the money, which meant understanding the full complexity of how funds moved between the legitimate businesses and the informal operations and the community distribution, and ensuring that each channel continued to function without creating problems for the others. She maintained the relationships with the men who ran the street-level operations, not through intimidation or commands. Those tools were unavailable to her, even if she had wanted to use them, but through the specific authority that comes from being the person who is consistently right about what needs to be done and consistently reliable about ensuring it happens. She also built something that had not existed before, or had existed only in fragmentary form. She built what would eventually be called the Fund, though it had no name then and would never have an official name. By organizing the informal giving that had always been part of how Bumpy operated into a system reliable enough to be counted on, the churches knew who to contact. The block association presidents knew what kind of situations qualified. The women who ran the building networks that were the actual nervous system of Harlem's daily life knew that certain kinds of need would be addressed if they brought them to certain people's attention. The reliability was the innovation, not the giving itself, that had always existed in various forms throughout the community. From the informal mutual aid societies that had operated since the first decades of the neighborhood's formation, to the individual generosity of people who had a little more than their neighbors. What had not existed was the consistent, predictable, systematized reliability that made it possible for families in difficulty to count on something specific being available rather than hoping that something would materialize. Reliability of this kind required organizational capacity, which required a person with the intelligence and the relationships and the judgment to build and maintain it. That person was Mame Johnson. She built it during 3 years when the man who would eventually be credited with it was in a federal penitentiary. She built it out of her own relationships, her own knowledge of the community, her own understanding of what was needed and what was available. And she handed it back to him when he came home in 1935, not as something she had created and was transferring ownership of, but as something that existed and that belonged to both of them and to the community it served. This was, perhaps, the most complete expression of how their partnership worked. There was no territorial negotiation, no negotiation about credit. There was simply what existed and what it needed and who was best positioned to provide it. The work was the thing, not who was seen doing it. The years of Bumpy's first imprisonment, 3 years, from 1932 to 1935, were the years in which the organization's relationship to Harlem's community was most decisively shaped. The numbers operation continued. The protection arrangements continued. But the fund was new, and its newness carried with it a quality of community relationship that had not previously been organized in this way. When Bumpy came home, he came home to a Harlem that related to his organization differently than it had 3 years earlier, because the organization related to Harlem differently, more systematically, more reliably, more embedded in the daily functioning of the neighborhood's support structures. This was Mame's contribution, not exclusively. Bumpy had always given to the community in informal ways, and the impulse was his as much as hers. But the system was hers, built by her during 3 years in which she had both the necessity and the freedom to build it. Because he was gone, and what he had built needed something he hadn't built yet, and she could see what it needed. The years of Bumpy's first imprisonment, 3 years, from 1932 to 1935, were the years in which the organization's relationship to Harlem's community was most decisively shaped. The numbers operation continued. The protection arrangements continued. But something was added during those years that had not been as systematically present before, which was the fund. The envelope distribution. The quiet movement of money toward families who needed it in ways that the official systems had decided not to address. This was Mame's contribution. Not exclusively, Bumpy had always given to the community in informal ways, and the impulse was his as much as hers. But the system, the organized, reliable, consistent mechanism that made the giving predictable rather than occasional, was something she built during those 3 years, using her network of relationships in the churches and the block associations, and the community organizations that were the actual connective tissue of Harlem's daily life. She understood something about how communities worked that the men who ran organizations like Bumpy's sometimes missed, which was that the loyalty of a community was not purchased through fear or even through money, but through reliability. People gave loyalty to the things they could count on, and what they counted on was not the dramatic gesture, but the consistent one, the envelope that arrived when it was supposed to arrive, the problem that was solved when it was supposed to be solved, the help that appeared without requiring the person who needed it to explain themselves to anyone who might judge them for needing it. She built that reliability. She built it over 3 years while her husband was in a federal penitentiary, using the relationships she had and the intelligence she possessed and the specific quality of her judgment, which was that she was almost never wrong about what a situation required. Once she had accurately assessed what the situation actually was. When Bumpy came home in 1935, the organization he returned to was more deeply embedded in the life of Harlem than the one he had left. This was not something he acknowledged publicly. The acknowledgement would have required him to describe what she had done in terms that made her role visible, and visibility would have undermined the effectiveness of everything she had built. Instead, what existed between them was a shared understanding of what had happened and what it meant, communicated through the specific quality of the partnership that resumed when he walked back through the apartment door. She said once, in the memoir she wrote 70 years later, that she had known on the day he came home that the 3 years had changed something in both of them, not in the direction of the change, which had been toward each other in both cases, but in the certainty of it. 3 years of managing what he had built had given her a knowledge of its mechanics, and its people and its vulnerabilities that she had not possessed before, and 3 years of Alcatraz had given him a knowledge of what she was capable of that he had suspected but had now seen, demonstrated under conditions that left no room for charitable assessment. They had each become, in those 3 years, more fully themselves, and what they were fully turned out to be a more complete team than what they had been partially. The marriage, when it came in 1948, was, in some ways, a formality applied to an arrangement that had functioned as a marriage for nearly 20 years. But Mame understood the value of the formality. She understood that structures had purposes beyond their visible ones, that the act of making something official changed the way it was perceived, and that perception, in a world where perception did the work that rights and protections were unavailable to do, mattered in ways that could not be dismissed. The arrests continued through the 1940s and into the 1950s. The federal government's interest in Bumpy Johnson was persistent and at various points intense, and the legal machinery that it directed at him produced sentences that took him away from Harlem for extended periods. Each departure was a repetition, in larger form, of the original 1932 departure, and each repetition tested and confirmed what had become the fundamental architecture of their partnership, that Mame Johnson was not simply the wife of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, but the person without whom the entire structure of what he had built would have collapsed within the first year of his first absence. She managed the legal defense, not by practicing law, she was not a lawyer, but by becoming sufficiently knowledgeable about the legal processes that affected their lives, that she could work with the lawyers who handled the actual litigation with the specific intelligence of a client who understands the case rather than the anxious deference of one who doesn't. She knew which lawyers were worth their fees and which were not, and she knew the difference not from any formal legal training but from 15 years of watching the legal system operate on people she knew and loved, and of assessing the results of different approaches with the attention of a scientist recording experimental outcomes. This was not knowledge that arrived fully formed. She built it the way she built everything, through careful observation over time, through asking questions and remembering the answers, through the willingness to understand something unfamiliar rather than simply trusting the person who understood it to act in her interest. The lawyers who worked with them over the years learned, at varying speeds and with varying degrees of grace, that Mame Johnson was not a peripheral figure whose concerns needed to be managed, but a central one whose judgment needed to be engaged. The ones who understood this early worked more effectively with her. The ones who understood it late caused problems that required correction. She managed the finances. This was perhaps the aspect of her role that was most significant and least visible, because the financial management of a complex operation that spanned legitimate businesses, informal arrangements, and the community-facing fund required a quality of sophisticated accounting that was simply not visible in the public presentation of who Mame Johnson was. She was, to the outside world, a stylish and capable woman who stood by her husband through difficult circumstances. To the people who actually knew what was happening, she was the person who ensured that the money was where it needed to be when it needed to be there, that the legal fees were paid without disrupting the fund distributions, that the legitimate businesses continued to generate the visible income that the tax authorities could examine without finding anything they were not supposed to find. The complexity of this financial management was considerable. The legitimate businesses needed to function as actual businesses, not as fronts that produced the right paperwork, but as enterprises that generated real revenue and employed real people and served real customers, because anything less would eventually fail the scrutiny it would eventually receive. The informal operations needed to produce the funds that went into the legal defense and the community distributions, without those funds appearing in ways that created problems. And the community distributions needed to reach the people they were intended to reach, without creating a documentation trail that would attract unwanted attention. These three streams needed to remain genuinely separate in practice while being managed by a single intelligence that could see all three simultaneously. Mame Johnson was that intelligence for 35 years. She managed the streams separately and kept them separate not through complexity or obscurity, but through the specific clarity of a mind that understood what each piece of the structure was for and what it required to function, and that never confused what was convenient with what was correct. Convenience and correctness diverged frequently in the management of a situation like theirs, and the divergences were always moments of choice, and her choices were almost always the correct ones, which is why the structure survived what it survived. The Alcatraz years, from 1951 to 1963, were the longest and most demanding test. Alcatraz was not like other federal prisons. The physical and communicative isolation it imposed was specific and deliberate, designed to sever the connections that made a man's organization continue to function in his absence. The federal government had sent Bumpy to Alcatraz specifically because it believed that removing him so completely from his network would allow the network to dissolve or be absorbed by other interests. It had not accounted for Mame Johnson. The first year was the hardest, not because of the external pressures, those were manageable. She had managed them before, but because of the particular quality of absence that Alcatraz imposed. Other prisons allowed more frequent correspondence, more flexible visiting schedules, more communication between the incarcerated and the world outside. Alcatraz was designed with the specific intention of severing those connections as completely as possible without severing. Mame adapted to this the way she had always adapted to constraints, by understanding them completely and working within them with a precision that extracted maximum value from the available space. She learned the rules of Alcatraz's communication system not to circumvent them, but to operate within them so effectively that every permitted communication carried the full weight of what needed to be communicated. Every letter she wrote was exact. Every visit she made was used completely. But it was not only the communication with Bumpy that the 12 years required, it was the communication with everyone else, with the people who ran the various aspects of the operation, with the lawyers who worked the legal strategy, with the community members who relied on the fund, with the politicians and police officials whose Continued relationship with the organization depended on the continued presence of someone who could maintain those relationships with the same quality of judgment and reliability that the relationships had been built on. She became, in those 12 years, the person that everyone came to when they needed a decision. Not always visibly, she maintained, throughout, the specific invisibility that the constraints of her position required, but practically, functionally. The men who nominally ran various parts of the operation understood, with varying degrees of explicit acknowledgement, that the decisions that mattered were confirmed through Mame, and that a decision that Mame Johnson thought was wrong was a decision that was going to cause problems. This gave her an influence that was real and durable and completely outside any formal structure, which was exactly where she had always exercised influence and where she was most effective. She had no title, she had no official position. She had simply been the person who knew more, understood more, and could be relied upon more consistently than anyone else in the network. And 12 years of managing in Bumpy's absence had made this so thoroughly understood that it required no announcement. She maintained the relationships in Harlem through her own presence, her own authority, her own deep knowledge of the organization's people and their needs and their reliability. She maintained the fund through the same invisible infrastructure she had built in 1932 and refined over 20 years. By 1960, the fund had expanded beyond what it had been in 1951, serving more families in more systematic ways, because Mame had had 12 years to study what it needed and refine how it operated. And the studying and refining had been done with the attention of someone who understood that what the fund represented, the idea that the neighborhood took care of itself, was more important than any individual component of how it operated. She maintained something else, which was the understanding among the people who worked with them that the absence of Bumpy Johnson's physical presence was not the same as the absence of Bumpy Johnson's authority, because the authority had always been shared, and the person who shared it was here, was present, was paying attention, and was the person they needed to consult when they needed to consult someone. She visited Alcatraz several times in those 12 years. The visits were limited in duration and conducted under conditions designed to limit the information that could be exchanged. She used the time with the specific efficiency of a woman who had learned to communicate necessary things in the available space. She did not waste the visits on sentiment. There was sentiment. It was real and durable, but it was not the purpose of the visits. The purpose was coordination, and coordination was what happened. What she carried back from each visit was not just information, but the continued calibration of her judgment against his. The maintenance of the shared understanding that made their partnership functional across thousands of miles and years of separation. She knew, after each visit, not what Bumpy had told her to do, but what he would have decided if he had been in Harlem with full information. Because she knew how he thought and he knew how she thought, and the alignment between those modes of thinking was precise. Enough that it survived the most extreme testing circumstances the federal government had been able to devise. Bumpy came home from Alcatraz in 1963. He was 58 years old and had spent more than a decade in the most secure federal prison in America. Harlem received him not as a man diminished by the experience, but as a man whose return confirmed something that the neighborhood had never stopped believing, which was that the things he had built were still here and had been here throughout his absence because of the person who had kept them here. Mame was 51. She had spent 12 years running an organization that was not officially hers to run, managing a community relationship that was not officially hers to manage, maintaining a fund that was not officially documented anywhere, and ensuring that the person she had spent her adult life building a partnership with had something intact to come back to. The 5 years that followed, the last 5 years of Bumpy's life, before his death in June of 1968, were the years that Mame Johnson would later describe as the fullest of the partnership. Not the easiest, because the world was changing rapidly in ways that created new pressures, even as it removed some old ones. And the adaptation required was continuous and demanding. But the fullest, in the sense of most complete, because both of them were present and healthy and functioning at what they had become after 35 years of building themselves and each other. She was with him when he died at the Wells restaurant in Harlem on June 7, 1968. He had collapsed at dinner, of a heart attack, at 62 years old. The manner of his death, ordinary, public, in a Harlem restaurant, among people he knew, was in keeping with the manner of his life in ways that the people who knew him best found appropriate. Even if appropriate was not the word they would have chosen in the moment. What followed for Mame was 40 years of living in a world that consistently underestimated what she had been and continued to underestimate what she was. She was described in press accounts as Bumpy Johnson's widow, which was accurate and insufficient. She was asked about her husband in interviews, always about her husband, the assumption being that the story was his and she was its context. She answered those questions with the patient precision of a woman who had spent her entire adult life working in the space between what she actually was and what the world's categories allowed her to be described as, and who had long since made peace with the gap. What she did not answer in those interviews was the fuller question that no one thought to ask, which was what she herself had been doing during all those years. It was not a question the world of 1968 or 1978 or even 1988 had the framework to ask. The framework that would have allowed the asking was still being built by the women who came after her, many of whom had no idea that Mame Johnson existed or that her life was one of the blueprints they were working from. She worked on her memoir for years before it was published in 2008, when she was 96 years old. She called it Harlem Godfather, the rap on my husband, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The title was appropriate in ways she may or may not have intended. It was a book about her husband, and it was also, between every line and sometimes directly on the lines, a book about herself. The reviews it received noted the vivid detail of the Harlem she described and the complicated portrait of a man who was both a criminal and a community figure. Some reviewers expressed surprise at the warmth and clarity of her voice, as if they had expected the memoir of a 96-year-old woman who had spent her life in difficult circumstances to be either bitter or vague. It was neither. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 60 years understanding things that most people never fully understood and who, at 96, had no particular reason to pretend she hadn't. She wrote about Bumpy with love and with accuracy, which is the hardest combination to sustain in memoir. And she wrote about Harlem with the specific authority of someone who had not observed it from a distance, but had been, for most of a century, one of the people who kept it functioning. She died in 2009, at the age of 97. She had outlived her husband by 41 years. In those 41 years, she had done what she had always done, which was to pay attention to what was in front of her and respond to it without requiring that the response be visible in order to be real. The memoir was the one formal acknowledgement of what she had witnessed and done, made at the end of a life in which the absence of formal acknowledgement had never been the same as the absence of the thing itself. The apartment on Edgecombe Avenue had held two extraordinary people. The world had only ever fully recognized one of them. The other had recognized herself, clearly and without resentment. From the day she sat at the kitchen table with a letter from Alcatraz, and understood that what was needed was not someone to mourn what was happening, but someone to manage what came next. She managed it. For 60 years and 40 years beyond that, she managed it with the specific quality that had always made her indispensable and invisible in equal measure. The certainty that the work was more important than the credit, that the thing being built mattered more than who was seen building it, and that the most durable structures were the ones that didn't require the builder to be present in every account of what was constructed. Harlem remembered Bumpy Johnson. It knew his name, told his stories, understood what he had meant to the neighborhood, and what it had cost him, and what he had taken from it in return. The accounting of his life was complex and honest and incomplete, in the ways that accounts of complicated lives are always incomplete. What it was consistently slow to include was the woman who had been the operational center of everything he built, who had kept it functioning through a combined 12+ years of his imprisonment, who had built the community relationship that made the name mean something beyond mere power, and who had lived long enough to write her own account of it all at 96 years old with a clarity and a precision that should have startled no one who had been paying attention. She had been paying attention her entire life. She had simply been doing it in a room that the cameras didn't point at, managing things that the newspapers didn't write about, keeping in operation the specific machinery of care and loyalty and reliable presence. That made Harlem what it was during the years that Bumpy Johnson was its most famous resident. That was Mame Hatcher Johnson. That was what she was, and what she did, and what she left behind her. The memoir exists. The name exists. The story, fully told, is still becoming visible. The way things that have always been there become visible when enough time passes and enough people learn to look in the right direction. She sat at a kitchen table in November of 1937 with a letter from Alcatraz, and she understood what was required of her, and she put on her coat and went downstairs. That was the beginning of the story. The story lasted 72 more years. The memoir, when it finally appeared in 2008, was 96 years in the making, and showed it, not in any way that suggested age had diminished the voice, but in the way that long perspective gives writing a quality of completeness that shorter perspectives cannot produce. She had seen enough of what she was describing to understand it from the inside and from sufficient distance simultaneously, which is the rarest and most valuable position from which to write about anything. What the memoir made available to anyone who read it carefully was a window into the actual mechanics of how Harlem had worked during the decades it described. Not the legendary version, not the romantically simplified version that historical distance tends to produce, but the specific, daily, operational reality of what it had taken to keep the community relationship intact across 35 years of external pressure. The envelopes and who delivered them, the lawyers and which ones were reliable, the relationships with politicians and what maintaining them required, the fund and how it reached people and why reaching them the way it did was different from reaching them any other way. These details mattered not as gossip or as the color of a biography, but as documentation of a system that had worked, built by a woman whose name had not appeared in the accounts of how it worked. The memoir was her signature on what she had built, placed there 96 years after the building had begun, at a moment when enough time had passed that placing it there felt less like claiming credit and more like completing a record that would otherwise remain incomplete. She died the following year. The record she had completed was the one that remained.